chair. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Robert Doerr, and I am the Mortgage Fellow in Poverty Studies here at AEI. Our topic today is working class families. What are their most pressing challenges? How are they faring in our economy? What do they want for themselves and their children from government? And how well do they think government and business leaders are doing in addressing their concerns? These are good questions, and ones that we in Washington could be accused of trying to answer without first consulting with and listening to the very people we are talking about. That is why we are so happy to have David and Amber Lapp here to report on their work with working class parents from Southern Ohio. David and Amber are both research fellows at the Institute for Family Studies and affiliate scholars at the Institute for American Values and co-investigators of the Love and Marriage in Middle America Project, a qualitative research inquiry into how working class young adults form relationships and families. Their work, both separately and together, has appeared in media outlets such as the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic Online, and First Things. After their presentation, we will have a moderated discussion with some of Washington's brightest commentators on these issues, and that discussion will be moderated by AEI visiting scholar Brad Wilcox. And let me just say a word of introduction about Brad. Brad is a visiting scholar here at AEI, where he directs the Home Economics Project. Inaugurated in the fall of 2013, the research project explores the links between family structure and economic growth. More specifically, he examines how marriage and strong family life contribute to the life of our country. Dr. Wilcox is also an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Virginia, where he directs the National Marriage Project. He is a fellow at the Institute for Studies of Religion at Baylor and has been a research fellow at Yale, a research associate at Princeton, and a Civitas fellow at the Brookings Institution. And I also would like to say that Brad is a great colleague. He shows his commitment to better outcomes for poor and struggling children, not only by his work, but by the way he provides leadership and guidance to the rest of us in the Poverty Studies Unit at AEI. So with that, I'll turn it over to David and Amber for their presentation, and I hope we have a good discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's very good to be here. We're coming from Southern Ohio, and we almost thought about asking our three boys whom we brought with us to, just present this, but they decided that a trip to the zoo was a better fit for them. So here we are. So we are here today because less than a month after the 2016 election, Amber and I convened a focus group of 10 working class parents in Southern Ohio to hear what they thought the Trump administration could do to help working class families. And the participants in our group were all 7 couples. They were all white and all were in their 20s or 30s. And all of them had at least a high school education, but no one had a 4-year college degree. And all of them were either working or pursuing some further education or training. And 6 of them were married and 1 was cohabiting. And before presenting them specific proposals from policymakers, we asked them an open-ended question about the challenges that they face in providing for their families, achieving their ideal work-family arrangement, and having a healthy relationship. And here are some of the responses. "We don't make enough money," said a sous chef immediately, who makes $13 an hour at a retirement community located in an affluent Cincinnati suburb. "We hate living paycheck to paycheck," he said. His wife, a hospital registrar, said, "Rent is one of the worst things I've seen," she said, to lots of agreement, adding that it was extremely difficult for them to be able to get approved for a mortgage. And another person said, "Yes, and we have student loans too, so we're up to our eyeballs in student loans." That was a stay-at-home mom who was studying medical billing and coding in hopes of re-entering the workforce to help pay the bills. Overall, 4 of the 7 couples represented said that they could not imagine buying a house even within 10 years. So for most of them, this was just like a distant hope. Only one of the couples there owned a home. The others either rented, lived in public housing, or lived with relatives. So, as I noted, there was some people who were, there was at least one stay-at-home mom who was trying to re-enter the workforce to try to help pay the bills and achieving further training. But at the same time, some participants noted that sometimes re-entering the workforce or entering the workforce works against you because the opportunity to get public assistance may unintentionally come with disincentives to work. A part-time McDonald's worker whose husband works at a factory explained that while their incomes were they were having difficulty paying the bills, and so she got this extra job at McDonald's, but they made just a little bit too much to qualify for public housing. So she said, I was working 3 days a week just to help bring in extra money to our house, but then we looked at the income guidelines for public housing and realized that we wouldn't qualify. I was making too much. So I had to cut back my hours. I can only work 1 day a week, which seems so backwards to me, she noted. Other participants agreed. One man was enrolled in a program studying advanced manufacturing, and he was living in public housing with his girlfriend. He said, public housing is completely wrong to me. You're supposed to be there to build yourself, build your family, and your rent is going to be X amount of dollars. But say you get a better job. They're going to increase your rent, and you're in a hole. So I asked him, so does it feel like the more you work, the more behind you are? Exactly, he said. And you just got that raise, you just got on your feet, and now they're kicking you while you're down. And that discussion led some to bring up the issue of payroll taxes. A warehouse team leader said, the structure, whether we're talking about public assistance or just regular income, the guiding principle has been the more you make, the more we take. And if you want to give the people the chance to make a comfortable living for themselves, that's a little counterintuitive. They take $300 out of each of my checks, said the sous chef, who received his check every other week. They take $400 out of mine, said his wife, the hospital registrar. The number one issue for me is the taxes, said a factory worker and a self-professing Reaganomics fan. He said, you look at my paycheck and it says, you made $1,000. And then you look at the bottom and it says, you only get $600. And at this, there was laughter and general agreement. If you gave me $200 of that $400, we would be good. So when we asked them open-ended question about the challenges they're facing in their families, they mentioned everything from living paycheck to paycheck to inability to get a mortgage to student debt and complaints about taxes, payroll taxes. And payroll taxes did keep on coming up throughout our conversation, even though it wasn't on our radar screen entering the conversation. We weren't expecting to talk about this. So for instance, during the paid parental leave conversation, the self-described angry factory worker said, there we go again, getting greedy. How much is that going to cost us in taxes later? How much is that going to cost America in production in order to keep up with other countries? That's how we got ourselves into this mess. We're all complaining about higher taxes. Well, there you go. There's your road to the Soviet Empire right there. So he's a little dramatic. And at one point, a stay-at-home mom said, if we just cut down on what the government is taxing us and what they're helping us with, just let us run our own lives with less taxes. And then her husband added, yeah, it's unfortunate that taxes wasn't one of the topics on the list of policy proposals, to which another person noted, yeah, we kind of added that on our own, which they did. And perhaps this is because it's so concrete. They get their paychecks, most of them every other week. And as the one person said, you can look on the bottom, and it says, this is how much was taken out. And if you're living paycheck to paycheck, money is tight, then payroll taxes seems like a natural place to look for more money, especially more of your own money. And of course, so note where they didn't go looking for more money was they didn't talk about tax deductions and even the earned income tax credit, even though many of them benefit from it. And that's when we're talking about tax deductions, EITC, and so forth. In our experience, many people that receive thousands of dollars in assistance from it don't even know about the EITC. They know they're getting a big tax return, but they don't know what's involved with that. And it's all just it seems like magic. And so it's convoluted and it's opaque, and it only comes once a year. And most of the people also said that they use their tax refund to catch up on bills that they're behind on. Maybe they're behind a couple months on rent or the phone bill or whatever. And so the consensus was that, quote, one person said, though everyone feels great when that tax return arrives, it would be more helpful to keep more of their own money throughout the year. So that was the challenges. And then after discussing those challenges, we wanted to get their reactions to some specific policy proposals that seek to address work-family issues. And we talked about plans for paid parental leave, fair scheduling legislation, child care assistance, minimum wage, and eliminating marriage penalties from public assistance programs. But in our remarks today, we're going to focus on their reactions to the proposals about paid family leave and child care assistance. And also, a prefatory note before I hand it over to my wife, Amber, who's going to talk about their reactions. When we presented the various proposals, we didn't say, Hillary Clinton proposed this or Donald Trump proposed this, because we wanted to get their most objective assessment of the policies without political or ideological favoritism getting in the way. So with that, I'll hand it over to my wife, Amber, who will talk about their reactions to paid parental leave and child care assistance.
Thank you, David, and thank you for having us. So we presented two different paid parental leave plans. One was Hillary Clinton's plan to provide 12 weeks of leave for both mother and father, and Donald Trump's plan to provide 6 weeks of leave of maternity leave. The first to speak up was a father who, during the birth of his son, was working at a major carrier services company, and it was December at the height of their busy season when he said that normally employees weren't able to take leave, but he was able to get 1 week of unpaid leave. And in his opinion, he liked the Clinton plan, the 12 weeks of leave, because he said, I want to give what gets the most benefit right away. He really valued that time that he was able to have home with his son and his wife. The part-time McDonald's employee also said that she liked Clinton's plan because of the paternity leave. She said, fathers get lost. They don't have the option of getting leave to spend time with their new children. The mothers have had the advantage of carrying that child for 9 months. The fathers don't get the opportunity to bond with a new child until the child is physically there. But she did say that 6 weeks would be fine, and some other people seemed to agree with that. At first, the self-described angry factory worker and Reaganomics fan said that he had concerns about the cost of such a program. But as the conversation went on, he started to recall his own experience of becoming a father. And he said, with that first child, it was crazy. And he remembered waking up in the middle of the night, kind of freaking out and saying, oh, it's 2 a.m., is the child still breathing? And so he said that he would be in favor of some sort of leave policy, especially for first-time parents. Other people told their own stories. One woman talked about returning to work after just 3 weeks after a C-section, and the work that she did involved some physical labor. Another mother said to her, that's dangerous, to which she responded, Well, I did what I had to do. I've got 4 kids to feed. Another woman then said, yeah, I've had many times I've been told not to work by a doctor, and I've withheld that information from my employers because I have to work. So some of these times included high-risk pregnancies. She's a diabetic, and she also had preeclampsia during one of her pregnancies. She was supposed to be on bed rest in the final weeks because of elevated blood pressure, but instead, she was, in fact, working 2 jobs, one as a maid during the day, and then in the evening, she would put on a Statue of Liberty costume and go stand on the sidewalk holding a sign for Liberty tax. So she was on her feet all day instead of bed rest. But she said if she didn't work, because she had no paid leave, she would fall behind on rent and face possible eviction. She said, I hated it because I didn't have a choice and I missed that bonding time. She also said that when she had her daughter, she went back to work when her daughter was 3 days old. And when her daughter was 2 weeks old, she actually found out that she had cancer. And she continued to work with just having a baby and also through the treatments. So by the end of the conversation, everybody in the room agreed that Congress should consider some form of paid parental leave legislation. There was the quote from the daycare worker. But there also several recipients seemed to agree that 12 weeks wasn't necessary, that 6 weeks would be great. I think part of that's because nobody had ever received any paid parental leave before, and so even that 6 weeks seemed like a great luxury. The next topic that I'll discuss is childcare assistance, but before I delve into that, I'll just say a few words about women's work preferences. And even though we had such a relatively small focus group, there was a great diversity of preferences. And for example, one woman who currently worked part-time at McDonald's said that ideally she would love to be a stay-at-home mom because she feels like she can teach her kids better than anybody else. And she actually said, I miss the 1950s society where the mother could stay home and that was her job. Other women preferred part-time work and combining that with staying home. And for example, the hospital registrar, who often cries herself to sleep at night, she told us, because she only sees her 5-year-old daughter for like half an hour a day during her work days. She said that she would prefer to do part-time because she, quote, I like being at home sometimes, but I go stir crazy. So part-time was ideal for her. One woman expressed that she would like to continue working full-time. She was currently enrolled as a student studying advanced manufacturing, and she also worked at a daycare. And she said, I don't like being a home mom. I know it sounds really crappy being a mom, but I would rather be out there making a living, providing for my kids, knowing that they were taken care of than being a stay-at-home mom. And it was interesting because to that, a lot of the other members in the group jumped in with reassurances, no, it doesn't sound bad. No, it's fine. It's just personal preference. And so even though people were strong in their opinions about what they wanted for themselves, they wanted others to know that they saw these as all equally valid options. Others even mentioned other arrangements. For example, one of the daycare workers said that she liked to work and she liked to be with her kids, so she worked at a daycare. So regardless of preference, most of the members of our focus group said that childcare was a huge challenge for them. In fact, 2 of the mothers had started working at a daycare in order to get the discounted price and to be able to afford childcare. Another said she could only afford childcare because she knew the owner of the daycare. And then another stay-at-home mom said that she had no good options. She said, we're kind of stuck either way. If I go to work to make more money, it's all gonna go to childcare. And she could ask her parents for help with childcare for free, but she felt guilty doing that. So given these challenges, we were kind of surprised that most of the participants in our group were unenthusiastic about Trump's campaign campaign proposals to help families cover childcare costs. This included allowing families to deduct childcare expenses from taxes, or the average cost of childcare from taxes, and that would include stay-at-home parents and family members or friends providing childcare, and then also childcare spending rebates to lower-income taxpayers through the EITC. I think part of that cool reception might be part of what David was alluding to. Just this is kind of complex, and we found that whenever we were talking about a policy that involved tax deductions and that kind of thing, people tended to get kind of confused and there were misunderstandings. But it also seemed to come perhaps from an aversion to like cash handouts, because in response to the idea of the childcare spending rebate, one woman said, well, we don't want to live off the state either. We want to do it honestly. Another possible reason that people didn't seem so enthusiastic about this was that perhaps, as this one woman shared with us, that she doesn't trust childcare. She said, I've heard too many horror stories of things done to children inside of childcare. And so for her, that was not an option. But she did like the part about providing, or that included stay-at-home moms and family members who provided care. Although she was a bit hesitant about it too, because she said, I'm glad that it includes stay-at-home parents, but I don't see why it includes stay-at-home parents. So again, this kind of struggling to understand the logic of it. And to which one woman who received a child care voucher from the government, she responded and said, well, that kind of makes sense to me, because in a way it might be cheaper for the government, because I did the math, and for my kids to go to daycare, it's almost $5,000 a month to go. And she said, if I could stay home and the government didn't have to help me pay for childcare, that would help the government itself. So in conclusion, just one observation. Our focus group participants were not opposed to receiving public assistance, and in fact, they sometimes complained about their benefits being drastically reduced if they got a raise or that kind of thing. But they did recognize that they might need help with health care or food stamps or housing assistance in order to reach a point of stability for their family. They were also not opposed to the federal government ensuring paid parental leave, but they also strongly expressed that they don't want to, quote, live off the government, and they seem to resent it when the incentives were pointed towards less work and earning less. And as one man who lived in public housing with his girlfriend and was pursuing an advanced manufacturing degree said, I think he kind of summed it up when he said, long-term goal is to self-sustain farm way down the road. That's where I want to be. So in short, our respondents value public assistance, paid parental leave, and lower payroll taxes precisely for their potential to help them achieve greater economic independence and self-sufficiency.
So I'm happy to welcome up our panel now to discuss David and Amber Lapp's remarks on working class families and their views about work-family policy in Trump's America. And we have going kind of left to right here, Aparna Marthur is a resident scholar in economic policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute. And at AEI, her research has focused on income inequality and mobility, tax policy, and also, of course, work-family issues. Richard Reeves is a senior, Ramesh actually is just to her right. Ramesh Banuru is a senior editor for National Review magazine, a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a columnist for Bloomberg View, and a contributing editor to the domestic policy journal National Affairs. And then finally, Richard Reeves is a senior fellow in economic studies, policy director of the Center on Children and Families, and editor-in-chief of the Social Mobility Memos blog. His research focuses on social mobility, inequality, and family change. So I'm going to turn it over first to Aparna to get our conversation going.
Okay, can I get a clicker? I'll just stand here. Might be easier. Great. So thank you so much to all of you for being here, and to David and Amber for sharing the results of their focus group. I think it helps us better understand the goals that a new administration and Congress is likely to see for working families, and figure out the correct policy responses. So as David and Amber pointed out, these are the results from a focus group study in Ohio. We're looking at a relatively small sample. As an economist, we don't know how representative 10 sort of individuals are. But in this case, I think it was really interesting to see that a lot of the responses that you got tended to map very well with what we are seeing coming out from larger data sets and from sort of larger scale surveys of how households are dealing with these challenges. So you already talked about the demographics of these families. These are white working class millennials, mostly you said Trump supporters, as you found out. 10 participants, 6 of them were married. All of them had a high school education with working class jobs, and 2 stay-at-home moms and 1 unemployed person. Now, I think the general sense that we get from the focus group is that this feeling that the American dream is becoming nearly impossible to achieve. They're saddled with high levels of debt. Some of them had a lot of student loans. Some of them were not making enough money. They were living paycheck to paycheck. They were not able to own a home, which I think in many ways signifies the American dream for them. They were not making enough despite working really hard. You can see from all the responses that David and Amber pointed out, they were really doing their bit, doing everything right, and still not being able to do enough. And I think the general sense we get is, and their opinion was that if only people in government could come together and figure out the right responses, and it doesn't matter which side you're coming from. I think the general issues that working families are facing today are very common. It's not about Republican or Democrat, and we really need to fix some of these issues for us to be able to move forward. So on paid family leave, which is a big area for me, I'm working on, we have a working group that I'm heading along with Isabel Sawhill at Brookings. Richard is a part of it. We're looking at what's the likelihood and how do we design a federal paid family leave policy? And I think it was really interesting to me to see the responses coming out of just these 10 individuals. The idea that mothers would have to go back to work 3 days or even 3 weeks or even 3 days after having a child, I think is a compelling reason for us to think about having a federal paid leave policy. What we have currently is a system where federally we allow families to take about 12 weeks of unpaid leave, and employers have to guarantee their jobs at the time that they need to take the leave. That's not just for the birth of a child, but also for looking after your own sickness, for looking after your relatives if they are dealing with any illnesses. But the problem that we find is that because the leave is unpaid, most families really don't end up taking that leave. For a lot of low-income families, it's just impossible to survive a week without having that, some amount of pay coming in. And so the FMLA, which is the federal unpaid leave policy, is really, yes, it's a guarantee. Yes, it ensures that you have a job to come back to, but it's really not helping a lot of families to be able to feel comfortable taking that leave. Now, we do have 3 states in the US, California, New Jersey, and Rhode Island, that allow families some amount of pay, about 55 to 65% of pay that they were earning before they took the leave. And I think that has helped a lot of low-income families to feel more comfortable taking a few more days off. But I think even when you look at those states, the general lesson is that the take-up rates are still pretty low. A lot of families say, well, 55% wage replacement is not enough for us to take 6 weeks off. We don't feel like that's enough money. Often the paid leave program is distinct from the job protection that comes with the FMLA program. So if you don't qualify for the FMLA, you don't get the job protection in your paid leave, and then again, that makes you nervous about staying out of your work out of your job for a week or 2 weeks. So we are, these are things we're learning from the existing state programs. I think we're hoping that some of these lessons will translate into a better federal policy. But as you can see from the responses in the focus group, everyone says that a paid leave policy is essential. Now you can disagree about the design of the policy, but everybody thinks that families should be able to take, including fathers, should be able to take time off after the birth of a child or for dealing with illnesses, because that's critical. That's how families get the support, even in their working lives, to be able to meet their family responsibilities. This is similar to a finding that Pew just came out with just a few days back, where they did a large-scale survey of families and said, what are your attitudes to paid leave? Do you think this is a policy that we need to support? And almost universally, I think over 80% of people who were surveyed said, yes, we need a paid leave policy, that's essential. We disagree on how we fund it. We disagree on the parameters of the policy. But this is something that we need to be having a discussion about. So this is just a chart that shows you, access to paid leave across high-wage, low-wage workers, across full-time and part-time workers, and it's absolutely clear that a lot of low-wage workers simply don't have access to paid leave plans from their employers, or they're just not taking up the leave because they can't afford to take that time off. So as the focus group study pointed out, we don't care. Some people might say, well, 12 weeks is essential. Some people might say, well, 6 weeks is great as well. We're not even getting 4 days off, so 6 weeks is great. Those are the things that we really need to be having a discussion about. It's important to understand how we fund these policies. Do we do it through a payroll tax, the way the states are doing it, where there's some sharing in some cases between the employer and the employee in terms of their social insurance contributions? Do we do it by sort of placing the burden squarely on employers? I think the reality is that a lot of the actual incidence of these policies or of these costs is going to be on the employee. So I think we can debate about how we structure such policies. I think, but we also have to realize that at the end of the day, it's really the workers themselves who will be paying for these policies. And so I do think that it's important to have a good assessment of costs of these policies. I don't think we should jump into, let's have a 6 months off at 80% wage replacement. I think those policies are costly, and they will eventually be a big burden on businesses and on employees, but we have to, but we can't end the conversation at that. I think we need to figure out the details, and I think we need to be more transparent about the costs. Again, on childcare, it's no surprise to me that a lot of the proposals that the Trump plan and that you discussed to your focus group are really not something that the focus group was excited about. There's a recent analysis from the Tax Policy Center that shows that the bulk of about 70% of the benefits of the Trump childcare plan go to households earning above $100,000. About 25% go to households earning over $200,000. So this is not really a policy. When you talk about deductions are not going to benefit families that don't have a tax liability to begin with, which seems to be the profile of the people that you're looking at, though you don't report income data. But the bottom 40% of people don't have a federal tax liability, so for them to get a deduction doesn't really at the margin help them with childcare expenses. The larger issue is, of course, rising childcare costs, which these families are dealing with, and the quality of childcare that's available to them. Again, a Pew survey shows that for low-income families, if they actually do use formal daycare, the cost could be about 40% of their income. So that's super high, and a lot of families eventually end up shifting to informal sources of care. They're not going into formal daycare centers. They're in fact using informal care. I mean, the interesting statistic is that when you compare the other OECD countries to the US, the use of informal care in the US is way, way higher than in these other countries, in these other economies. So these high costs of childcare are also associated with women sort of having to choose at the margin. Do I really go and earn
a minimal amount in the labor market, or should I stay home and really offset the, not have to pay for childcare? So I think people are being forced to make those decisions. We do subsidize childcare through the tax code. We have a child tax credit that helps families meet some of their expenses. We have a child independent care credit. I think the problem with the subsidies in the tax code are simply that again, a lot of these are either only partly refundable or non-refundable. If that's the case, that's not money coming back to families that don't have a tax liability to begin with. And so again, it's not money that's really going to the lowest income families. These are benefits that are going to middle and upper income families, and the lowest income families are not benefiting from them. I think it was interesting where somebody talked about how we use the tax code. Why should we use the tax code to help stay-at-home moms? And I think as an economist, I think I tend to agree with that. We use the tax code to help offset expenses for working families who are contributing to the tax system. We can use other programs to help families offset childcare expenses. I have nothing against that, but I think using sort of the tax code to do this is a challenge. When it comes to the tax rates, I think it was interesting that everybody sort of focused in on payroll taxes, and again, that tells me that they was largely sort of left out of the tax system. Their essential burden was just the payroll tax. But here also, the idea that benefits are essentially imposing an implicit tax rate as benefits phase out. So what you find, there are studies out there from the Tax Policy Center that show that for a family that's earning about $40,000, the fact that you're phasing out of programs like food stamps, Medicaid, children's health insurance, housing assistance, and so on, imposes implicit tax rates of about 80%. And that's huge, considering that the top tax rate on the wealthiest families today is marginally lower than 40%. So I think we need to keep these trade-offs in mind, and I think that's the kind of thing that the focus group was also responding to. It was really interesting to see these very informed opinions on minimum wages. I think the general sense you always get when you see minimum wages being discussed in the media is that everybody is for a minimum wage hike. And I think what your 10 participants sort of had this nuanced opinion that, well, it's not okay for everybody to suddenly jump to a $15 minimum wage. I think the requirements of each job are different. Somebody whose job is more physically demanding might be entitled to that higher wage, but not someone else whose job is not as demanding or doesn't require as much training or effort. It was also interesting to see this quote about how even wage subsidy programs have unintended consequences, that there are costs associated with them that eventually will come from taxpayers. And so, and also the likelihood that if you give them a higher wage or a subsidy, that increases costs of living, and that's eventually going to feed back into higher costs for these families. The final point I wanted to make was on this notion that, it's not, everybody doesn't need to go to college. And I think, I agree with that. I think there's this, we're already seeing a lot of families sort of struggling with high levels of student debt. The unemployment rates for the youngest, teenagers and for those graduating college are much, much higher than what we're seeing on average for across all demographics. And so I think an alternative is to look at paid apprenticeship programs and is to encourage people to choose to get on-the-job training and to not graduate with high levels of debt, but actually get some amount of payment for being trained to do the jobs that they eventually would want to get into. So I really valued sort of the opinions of the focus group. They were much more informed than you would expect from such a small sample. Thank you.
Ramesh, are you going to use the podium?
No,
Maybe.
Ramesh,
I'll think about it.
Well, I don't want to be the odd one out, but I was going to sit there.
that's great.
I don't have slides or anything. You know what, I'm going to sit. Do you have slides?
No, no slides.
I have no slides. All right. How long ideally do you want us to speak for, Brad? 5 minutes. Okay, fine. I'll be as brief as possible. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, David and Amber, for your work. Many of us trade in quantitative data, survey data, economic data, national longitudinal survey data, and it's actually very rich, I think, to get this kind of qualitative data. And I agree with Aparna that inevitably people will say, wow, how representative was this 10 and so on. But it's a kind of data that I don't think we take seriously enough in policy analysis generally. So thank you not only for this piece of work, but for the work you do generally. A couple of things that jumped out to me, and then I'll make some broader points. One is this very strong issue of opacity and clarity of different kinds of help, right? Deductions and subsidies are opaque, taxes are clear, and that's always going to be a problem in the way you communicate policy. And so we know that, but it was very striking for that to kind of come out, and just really the kind of understanding that people have about how money's flowing, how help is flowing, where the subsidy is, and how much they're being helped in ways that they maybe don't understand. How some of those forms of redistribution might be across the life cycle, so they might look at how much Social Security is being taken, but they probably want retirement income. They probably want healthcare, they probably want schools, they probably want roads, they probably want the military to defend us, and so on. And so we all have that issue, but I just think as a kind of policymaker, being aware of that is helpful. And the other thing that really struck me, and I don't quite know where to go with this yet, was the reliance on public housing, and just how strongly people kind of felt about that, and the kind of trap that people kind of felt. The whole point of public housing is that it's supposed to be people who are really in need, but then they were saying, well, but if I do better, I won't get my public housing anymore, which is highly subsidized. Again, totally opaque subsidy. And I guess that's partly because of the preconception that public housing is kind of largely urban, et cetera, that to see sort of, this group of kind of working class white Trump voters very protective of their rights to subsidize public housing was quite striking. My comments, Aparna has also covered the quant pretty well, so I was just going to cover a couple of things very quickly. The first question, I think we always have to ask, why do we care about this issue? What's the problem here? It's very easy to just say, oh, we should have parental paid leave. Who's against that? No one, virtually, it seems. But why do we care? And I think we care for two reasons. One, because labour force participation is a huge macroeconomic issue and a productivity issue. And female labour force participation in the US in particular has, relatively speaking, dropped. It used to be 6th in the world, now 17th in the world. According to a comparison by OECD data, it looks as if a chunk of that difference is explained by differences in family-friendly policies, if you like. And so from a kind of labour supply point of view, there might be a good reason to worry about it. I primarily worry about it because of the inequalities that you see opening up between workers at different levels of the labour market, and what that means for their choices and their capacity, their ability to take care of their kids, have flexible work schedules and so on. I see a very strong class dimension to this story. And so, we know, for example, that there are very big gaps in the proportion of those from more affluent households who can access leave and take leave or negotiate flexibility, and those who can't. That has potentially intergenerational consequences, because the more you're able to look after your kids and do a good job as parents and so on, then the better your kids will do, and so the cycle turns. And so from an intergenerational equity point of view, it seems to me that we care about it for that reason. The second question, though, to ask is, why don't leave it to the market? We're talking about federal intervention, we're talking about costs, we're talking costs to employers, costs to taxpayers. We shouldn't just lightly move into, well, here's a problem, here's a solution, let's have a federal policy for it, right? Markets are pretty good at responding to demands and responding to kind of changes in people's preferences. So the question becomes, well, isn't the market going to respond? If people really want all this stuff, then they're just going to demand it from their employers. If employers don't give it to them, they'll go to another employer, and over time, we'll see that evolve. And the reason why I don't think that that's sufficient is because I see such a big difference in the capacity of the market to respond to different people. So, we know, for example, that if you earn less than 30,000, 1 in 5 of you have taken leave. If you earn, household income of less than 30,000, 1 in 5 have taken leave. Household income of more than 75,000, 3 in 5 have taken leave. And so actually, for those of us who are for people who are powerful in the labour market, I think they probably can, and they are getting better deals from their employers. It's the people who are less powerful in the labour market, and your stories really spoke to the people who don't have market power, sufficient market power to bring about the changes that are necessary, which in the end will hurt not only them, but more importantly their kids. 3 very quick points. 1, social norms. 2, job security. And 3, scheduling. as much of this is about social norms as it is about policy. So Japan has an amazing, I think Eleanor Krauss, who's our researcher, is in the back here, so she can pull me up if I get any of this wrong, but Japan has a very generous paternity leave policy, which has almost no effect because no one takes it. So you can be generous on paper, and we see that a lot in countries and companies. And that's really because the social norm around fathers taking time off in Japan is very weak. If anything, the social norm pushes the other way. And so if we're interested in kind of moving away from the different kinds of social norm, then we might think differently about the structure of policy. We've had in the past a sort of buy one, get one free model of the labour market. You bought the dad, you got the mum who would raise the kids for you in the background. But with the end of the buy one, get one free model, then actually given that women are kind of working as much as men, then actually that just puts different demands on people, but the social norm is lagging. And you see that even in this data here. And I think, ironically, it's particularly in the less powerful and less advantaged communities where women are very often in a better position to earn and progress than the men. But that's a very difficult switch for people to make. And so a lot of those mums we talk to might say, I'd like to work if I knew my kids are going to be well looked after. Well, how about if dad's looking after him? That's not a bad idea, but that doesn't really occur to people. And so that's where I think the possibility of some structure in policy that says, use it or lose it, this is just for fathers, a dedicated pot for fathers. I struggle with that because part of me just, really, I want to just leave it to parents. But if we want to change the social norm around gender, then we might want to think about that. And in the end, at least be honest about the fact that if we have so much gender inequality in the way we care for our kids, we should expect a high degree of gender inequality in the workplace. You can't really have one without the other. The other point, Aparna's already mentioned security, was my second point, job protection. That strikes me as so important. You know, we talk a lot about how much will it be paid, where will the money come from, but for a lot of people, it just seems like knowing I'll have my job at the end of this is hugely important, and so we shouldn't understate the security aspect of it. And then thirdly, it's not something that's come up so far, but I just wanted to put on the table, which is this issue of scheduling and the timing of work in relation to the timing of kind of rearing families, because you know, the idea very often here is what we want is family-friendly jobs, right? Family-friendly work. Very often what we're actually trying to design are kind of work-friendly families, job-friendly families. We leave work essentially unreformed, and then we have long hours of childcare. We expect women to work, in the phrase of one of the sociologists, quasi-men. And actually what we end up doing is shortchanging our kids. I don't think the point of any of the changes of recent decades has been that we all work full-time and have our kids being farmed out to somebody else. So if we're serious about, you know, family-friendly jobs rather than job-friendly families, what does that mean? Well, it means all of the stuff we've talked about, but it also means predictability and scheduling. So Susan Lambert has done some work, which I've written about fairly recently, about hourly paid workers, and I think most of your group hourly paid?
Yeah.
So more than half of the US workforce are paid by the hour, and Susan Lambert looked at a particular group, 26 to 32-year-olds, slightly more than half of them were parents. And of those, 41% only knew what their schedule was going to be a week in advance. And of those whose schedules varied, the average fluctuation was 50%. So I think that's a really interesting sort of subgroup to think about. If you don't know week on week when or how many hours you're going to be working, and so many of these other kind of clever policies are just not going to work. And so there are ways that actually, some ways in which you might regulate to give workers just a bit more time, a little bit more predictability in their schedules, which would allow them to organize childcare. We too often assume that our policy is based on the assumption that you have fixed 40 hours, 9 to 5, or whatever. And that's just so much not the world for a lot of short-term contract workers. And a lot of people we're most worried about, hourly, young, relatively disadvantaged workers, they're in pretty insecure and pretty unpredictable working environments. And so finding a way to flex policy around all that strikes me as almost as important as some of these big picture ideas around paid leave and so on. With that, I'll stop.
So I'm going to jump in here with a few remarks, and then I'll turn the discussion over to Ramesh for the final panel discussion. So I think that much of the policy discussion of late on work and family policy is focused on dual earner couples with kids. Policies, you know, like expanding the child independent care tax credit, or doing something with kind of a secondary earner tax credit. I like to suggest that these targeted policies are off the mark, or the sort of focus on a particular kind of family is off the mark, and for three reasons. getting this. Here we go. Yeah. So the first point that I would like to make is just to acknowledge the kind of heterogeneity in parental attitudes that we saw expressed by the working class focus group that David and Amber Lapp convened a few months ago in Ohio. Clearly, there wasn't kind of one particular model guiding how, for instance, moms were thinking about work and family arrangements. And we see the same kind of sort of heterogeneity or same kind of profound pluralism when we ask ordinary American adults and then ordinary American parents about how they would like to sort of organize work and family. What's striking is that if you look at data from Pew, for instance, you see that there really is sort of a real range of opinions from moms. A substantial share of them want to work part-time, a smaller minority want to work full-time, and a still smaller minority want to be at home full-time. But there is no one particular model of sort of organizing work and family that would sort of capture the allegiance of ordinary mothers in America. So I think we should kind of keep that, again, that plurality of preferences in mind when we're designing work-family policies so that we're not kind of privileging one way of organizing work and family policy. And that kind of pluralism also extends to actually how ordinary families in the US are actually organizing how they arrange work and family. You can see here, it's a fairly busy pie slide that is kind of, sort of mapping out how two-parent families and how single-parent families are combining work and family life here in the United States. But again, you can see that there is no one model that describes how a majority of families are handling work and family when they have kids 4 and under. And that same point also applies to two-parent families. So again, I think we need to be kind of attentive to both the profound pluralism that comes to preferences or beliefs about how to do all this, and the profound pluralism we see when it comes to work and family realities on the ground. And the third point is, and this is a point I think that often gets sort of glossed over in contemporary discussions about childcare in America, but there is evidence both from studies that are sort of tracking kids themselves across the life course. There's also kind of more, if you will, kind of ecological evidence that would suggest we should be at least somewhat maybe careful or concerned about the impact of extensive childcare on kids, particularly kids in the first year of life. And I have just two kinds of sort of references or quotes here from two different sets of scholars who are clearly not on the right. It's important, obviously, point to make on a topic like this, which is a little bit more sensitive in some quarters. But we have Jane Wohlfog, obviously a noted expert on children from Columbia University. Let me just turn so I can actually read this, saying that, quote, children tend to do worse if their mothers work full-time in the first year of life. Negative effects found in health, cognitive development, and externalizing behavior problems. And again, the point here is that there's a good bit of research suggesting that extensive non-maternal care in the first year of a child's life, particularly spending more than 30 hours a week in some kind of childcare arrangement, is not ideal for kids on the social and emotional front. And then the second bullet point here comes from a study of expansion of free childcare to families in Quebec from John Gruber and from his colleagues. And this study found that cohorts with increased childcare access subsequently had worse health, lower life satisfaction, and higher crime rates later in life. And the impacts in criminal activity are concentrated among boys. So again, we're sort of seeing some, I think, reasons to be concerned about making a major push for expanding childcare, particularly when it comes to childcare for kids in the first year of life. So the bottom line from my perspective, as we sort of think about ways to help both working class families like the ones that David and Amber Lapp talked about, and then just more generally, is that work family policy should seek to honor the choices of today's parents, varied as they are, and also should be kind of aware of the fact that extensive childcare for young kids, particularly infants, may have some noteworthy downsides. So in practical terms, this means, I think, focusing on expanding the child tax credit for parents of young children, and letting them use that money as they deem best in terms of what they think is sort of best for them and for their kids, rather than sort of putting a focus on expanding support in particular for childcare. Then also I think means pushing forward with efforts to expand paid parental leave to allow parents to spend more time at home with their infants. And so here I'm kind of echoing a point that Richard made just a few minutes ago. I think the bigger point here is that work-family policies need to make it easier for families to spend time at home with their children and less time at work. So thank you. I'm going to turn now the sort of discussion over to Ramesh to conclude our panel this morning.
Thank you, Brad. I want to thank you especially for saving me from one of my worst fears, which is to go directly after somebody with an English accent on a panel. So I appreciate that. I want to comment a little bit more
I'll
on...
say something now just to ruin it.
See, nobody warned me about this before. About the heterogeneity of familial preferences to which Brad and several of our other speakers have alluded. And it seems to me that it's something that policymakers too often lose sight of. I just recently read an article from a policy advisor to the Trump campaign, a former policy advisor, who was talking about the genesis of the Trump child care proposal. This policy advisor wanted something that was a little less pitched towards high earners than the eventual proposal, and was shot down. And he gave the quote about Ivanka Trump, and who was heading this project up. She was really just responding to Manhattan and elite urban circles. And I think that is reflected in the proposal that they came out with. So that's, I think, an extreme kind of myopia about these issues. But I think that there are less extreme forms of policymaker blindness to the variety of familial desires. And I think we need to we need to not only take account of that variety, but we actually need to respect that variety, that we shouldn't try to have a thumb on the scales and try to alter families' different preferences, because it makes sense for different families to organize their work and family lives in different ways. I don't think that we should have a preference, for example, for 2-worker over 1-worker families. Occasionally one will run across people who propose the reverse, and Neil Gilbert, the sociologist, has talked about a special subsidy for stay-at-home mothers, and I think he's a thoughtful guy, and he makes some interesting points, but I don't think that we should do that either. I think we should have a policy that strives toward neutrality. A second point I want to make is that just as work-family balance is hard to achieve in the life of an individual family, there's also a tension when it comes to policy, to which different speakers have also alluded. If we are geared towards helping families take care of their children, we are going to come up with a different set of policies than if our foremost concern is how do we raise maternal labor force participation rates. And I think that's just a tension where a choice has to be made. My own view, getting to my third point, is that the thing to do, maybe not the only thing, but at least the thing that I think is most worthwhile for a variety of reasons, is to expand the credit for children. The tax credit for children, both by making it larger and by having it apply not only to income taxes, but to payroll taxes, and not only to the payroll taxes that are technically paid by employees, but those that are technically, although not in the real economic incidence, paid for by employers. It seems to me that this has a number of advantages. One is that it offsets the large, though implicit, bias against large families that's contained in the structure of our entitlement. But second, and most relevant for our discussion here, it's not prescriptive. If a family wants to use the extra money to finance a longer leave, they can do that. If they want to do that to finance commercial childcare in part, they can. If they want to do it to finance a shift from full-time to part-time work, or from part-time work to just staying at home on the part of one parent, they can do that. If they want to put some of it aside to save for educational expenses, they can do that as well. I think it's just something that would be of use to all families, regardless of how they organize these things. And then it has another benefit compared to some of the other policies that sometimes get discussed, which is that the credit already exists, and so you just have to expand it. And then one last thing, compared to certain forms of paid leave proposals, although it doesn't apply to all paid leave proposals, I think it has the advantage that the cost is not exclusively borne by employers, which I think is the right way to handle these things, because we're talking about a social benefit, not a benefit that accrues to a particular workplace or a particular employer. Now, one of the things that is, I think, particularly on the right, that has impeded these proposals, that has kept them from getting the traction that I believe that they deserve, is what I'll call 47%ism, in honor of Mitt Romney's 2012 campaign. And this is the view that somehow payroll taxes aren't real taxes. And we refer to people not having a tax liability when, in fact, they have a substantial tax liability in the form of payroll taxes. And one of the things that I found really interesting about the Lapp's work is that it confirmed my priors, which is that actual people don't think in those terms. They don't make this distinction between payroll taxes and income taxes and think, well, I don't really pay taxes because it's just something called FICA that shows up on my pay stub. They do think of them as taxes, and they're right, they're taxes. If we can overcome that particular problem on the right, I think there is a chance to have a significantly better policy than the one we seem to be in store from the Trump administration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramesh. Let me just turn the conversation over to David and Amber Lapp to maybe offer any responses that they have to the panelists. Then we can give the panelists a quick chance to weigh in on anything else, and then we'll open up the floor to questions and comments from our audience today. So, David and Amber, do you guys have any comments?
Yeah, I wanted to make a note about what Richard brought up about scheduling, because this was something, I would say probably the strongest emotion was evoked when we talked about paid parental leave with the focus group, but then second to that was probably the fair scheduling legislation. And also we had unanimous support of some sort of fair scheduling legislation that should be considered.
The version that we presented for people's consideration was Senator Elizabeth Warren a couple of years ago presented I think it's called the Schedules That Work Act.
But there were several participants had mentioned that, for example, planning a trip to go visit family that lived in another state was very difficult because it was hard to know what their schedules would be. And two separate couples mentioned that they had to cancel planned trips last minute because of last minute scheduling practices. They were called into work and felt like they couldn't say no. And then another person, interestingly enough, actually didn't know if he would have his wedding day off. So he found out the day before his wedding. You know, they had sent out the invitations, everything was planned, and he was either just going to go to his wedding and lose his job, or thankfully he did have the day off. But the way that the scheduling worked, he was not even sure about that.
Yeah, and that points to what, Richard, you were saying about how we tend to have kind of have work-friendly families rather than the other way around. And so that's a big problem. The other point that I want to respond to is the fact that many of these low-wage workers, hourly workers, they really do not have a lot of power in the workplace. And so, for instance, I don't know the legality of this or how this works, but the one man mentioned that when he was working for this major a shipping company in December that he could only take 1 week of unpaid leave. That's how he put it. Of course, we know FMLA, you're supposed to get up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave. But,
and he thought that was generous. He thought he wouldn't be able to take any time. That was his
right.
understanding. And he mentioned, workplace politics. It's all about whether your supervisor likes you or not, or what they,
Yeah.
So.
Everyone in the group had stories to tell about unfair supervisor or somebody who just wasn't treating you, with dignity. And that's not just in this focus group, but in our work with working class young adults since 2010, that has come up a lot. Is a lot of people just do not feel like they are being treated with dignity in the workplace. And from their stories, I can see what they're saying.
And so one woman kind of summed it up when she said that some of these policies, like some sort of fair scheduling legislation, would make larger employers, it would ensure that they would show basic courtesy to employees, is the way she put it.
And I'll end on this, and then we can turn it over. One of the women in the focus group said that she was working at a fast food store a couple years ago, and she wanted to move up the company ladder. She was really excited about working there. She loved it, but she also had 2 or 3 kids at the time. And her manager basically, she said, told her, well, if you want to become, supervisor and move on up, you need to be really flexible. But she couldn't be flexible because her husband worked full-time, and she worked full-time when he wasn't working. And so essentially, she was being penalized, not able to move up the company ladder, is what her supervisor was implying, because she had a family to care for and she didn't have complete flexibility to be available whenever they needed her.
Children are notoriously inflexible.
It's true.
Can I just add a note on that, because I'm sure we'll get into the policy discussion, but we're often talking about money and regulation, but we're actually talking about quite basic things, power and time. And if you think about the history of the Industrial Revolution, that was a power struggle over control over time. And it's particularly power over time. Who controls your time? And so power in the labor market and the way that translates into control over time, predictability of time, these are very basic, long-standing issues in industrial economies, which is power and time. I mean, there's a reason why the trade union movement was kind of built on 10-hour weeks and control, because the employers got power over my time, and then we had to claw it back through kind of collective action. I'm not suggesting for a moment that's the approach now. I actually like this idea of pluralism, but pluralism as an idea without power actually just washes out. It doesn't work for the very people we're talking about. So it's how do we empower people to exactly do what you've said, and I think Brad too, about respecting their kind of choices. And it seems to me there is a power imbalance in the bottom half of the US labor market right now. How we address that power imbalance to give people more of this control over their time, that's what we're discussing.
And one more thing on the how the employer is dealing with the employees. I think this was also interesting in the context of paid family leave studies, where even in states where they have paid leave, like in California, a lot of the surveys show that people are just not aware that they can actually access 6 weeks of paid leave. And they say, the employer never told us about it. We were told that we could take like sick days and vacation days, and that's how we would sort of cobble together that time off. But they were not told, and that's just so surprising. Like, this is a state-level policy. This is, this is your right in so many ways to have access to those 6 weeks, and it just never came up. 50% of people say we just didn't even know that policy existed. So it's so much about just, information and, how you are dealt with in your workplace as well.
Okay, let's open up the floor to questions and comments. Yes, you remember in the front? We have a mic coming up the aisle here. If you could also say who you are, that'd be great.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. My name is Li Yang. I think more important than we talk about child care or taxation, I think important is we put a concept like household production. And for education, you might want to consider why people choose homeschooling rather than private school or choice school. So I just wonder if you have any study or analysis of, let's say, occupation by those household members, the husband or wife. And when you choose the child care, whether you consider the child care caregivers quality or occupation, because you can have a choice of child care plus some teaching together, rather than just say leave their children to somebody else, a stranger, or maybe even an abuser. So I just wonder if you have this type of analysis.
Well, I mean, so you're talking about the option of homeschooling for these families? Is what you're,
Quality of childcare.
The real quality of childcare by yourself or by somebody else who are just like a substitute teacher,
Right.
they can be very good quality. And whether the real saving or the real production, household production, or your final assets, final savings from the childcare, instead of you go to work and without any net savings to pay even the rent. You can really buy a house rather than pay the rent.
Yeah, I think that this was something that was a concern for some people. I know the one factory worker, he mentioned when we were talking about childcare, he said, he brought up the quality of education, and he said, you know, what are they doing? Are they watching SpongeBob or learning their ABCs? Yeah. And so his opinion was that he would rather have his wife home with their girls, and that was her preference as well. And I know that one of the other quotes I shared in which she said that, you know, I feel like I can teach my children better than anyone else. And she sent her kids to public school. She didn't homeschool, but she felt that she, again, to this point of women and men wanting to spend more time at home and raising their children themselves instead of outsourcing that completely. That did come up over and over. One woman mentioned that her son had some developmental delays, and she felt she needed to get into the workforce, but there was this tension because she wanted to be home to help her son since he had those developmental delays.
Robert, there in the back.
Robert Dorff, may I? On the child tax credit, I think this has been a great discussion, and thank you very much. And Ramesh, you almost had me all the way there. It really was very good. I wondered if there are any parameters on higher income or lower income. In other words, you have to have payroll taxes to refund against, and how do you see that?
Yeah. I don't, at the higher end, I don't think it's that important a question. You know, if you want to reduce the budget cost by having a cap on it, as the current child credit does, I think that's fine. You might want to phase it out based on work disincentives. At the lower end, the fact that, you know, payroll taxes apply to the first dollar that you earn, I think tends to alleviate the problem that you sometimes have with tax credits that don't apply against payroll taxes. My own view is that you would use the credit to wipe out payroll tax liability, both employer and employee side, and that's the cap. That is, you don't get money beyond that from the government. It's just tax relief. Other people argue for an even more liberal policy, which is, you know, a child allowance, and, you know, we can discuss that. But the policy I'm talking about that is a significant, offers significant tax relief to people at the low end of the income spectrum.
Ramesh, are you talking about making the child tax credit also refundable in some sense?
Yeah, I mean, as the
Yeah.
word refundable is typically used, absolutely,
Yeah.
yes.
This is essentially Hillary Clinton's plan.
She had a policy that only applied to the first 5 years, which is
That's right.
an expansion
It was for the youngest
which
kids,
is
yeah.
which is a good, you know, I could certainly live with that. I don't know if she went all the way against. I think she went a little bit past wiping out payroll tax liability in
I think
her
she
plan.
did, but
yeah.
it's different.
But it's the same sort of.
It's
same
difference
sort
of
of idea,
detail.
yeah.
They're basically
It was-
endorsing her plan.
It was the aspect of her platform that I liked best. The second one being not being Donald Trump, I suppose. And vice versa for him. But.
Orion?
Thank you. First of all, David and Amber, thanks for coming and for the work that you've been doing that benefits all of us, I think, long before it was cool to be talking to white working class voters in Southern Ohio. I think it was kind of clear that the theme underlying all of these different specific policies is economic insecurity. And then we have all of these different symptoms of it. And then there's a tension of how much does our policy want to respond to the underlying insecurity versus symptoms A, B, C, D, E. And I'm fascinated by how it intersects in the family leave sense, because you can break a paid leave policy into two components. You could describe 6 weeks of leave as a $4,000 check and a prohibition on working for the next 6 weeks. That functionally is what it is. And so I'm curious, especially as you I don't know that you asked them this question, but as you think about the conversation with those families, if that was how the policy was presented, would they want the $4,000 check and then take 6 weeks off, or would they rather have the $4,000 check and keep going to work because the economic insecurity is that heavy of a pressure?
That's a really good question. I think even in our small group, it would probably vary based on their situation. And, there was a spectrum of economic insecurity even in our group. And so I could imagine that those who were, like the woman who mentioned that she felt she had to work because she might be evicted, that she might prefer to take that $4,000 and then, take a week off or 2 weeks off or that kind of thing, and then have the money to use for some other purpose.
Can I say something on that, Brad?
Sure.
Because I think it speaks a bit to Ramesh's point that it helps to clarify what's the goal here. Because I can think of at least three goals, and one is I mentioned labour force participation. That would lead you one way. Another is respecting the choices of parents. That would lead you another way, just being as neutral as possible. And then thirdly, the development of the child development, which doesn't necessarily align with parental choice. We assume it will because it's much more comfortable to assume that, but we should never forget that the kids who hear the least words spoken to them are the kids whose mums are on welfare. Their mums are at home. And so there's all this intervention now to try and improve the kind of learning environments and the kind of poorest homes, right? So although it's a very, very uncomfortable subject, we shouldn't just automatically assume that the best way for kids to develop in the richest way is for them to be with their parents. That's not always true. But this speaks to that. So perfectly neutral policy would be a universal child allowance lump sum payment on the birth of each child. Here's X $1,000. Congratulations, you're a mum or a dad. Here's your check. Do what you want. Use it to buy some time off work. Use it to go on vacation. Use it to buy stuff. Use it to get your granny to come in. Entirely up to you. It would be a supremely non-paternalist policy. It would be completely neutral about whether you should work or not work, be with your kid or not be with your kid, use the money to go to Vegas or use the money on new baby carriages. Who am I to say? I'm not a paternalist, it's up to you. So I think it takes kind of the spirit of your idea, which is totally non-paternalist, totally non-neutral, and say, here's the money, do whatever the hell you like with it. But I'm just interested to know what other people think of that.
I would just, it depends on how you fund it. So I think the idea behind paid leave is that there's some contribution coming from the employer and the employee, and so just saying, okay, we funded into this program, and now here's your check, and you do what you want. I don't think that would really fly. To get more people to opt into a social insurance policy where you're just saying, okay, now we'll give you the money and go to Vegas. I just feel like that would not be something that most people would support.
I mean, that is how most insurance works, though, right? Like when you crash your car, you can use the check to fix the car, or not.
Or not.
That's true, but I think in paid leave,
I've heard Vegas has gotten family friendly though. So.
Much more so.
And one of the things, I'll wrap up with this. One of the things that we would have to contend with, right, is the idea that it would be seen as a cash handout from the government, and that's seen as, no, that's what the person who's not working and is just depending on taking advantage of the government. That's what they do. That's not what I do. So one would have to present it in such a way that it overcomes that perception.
But if you present it as like a child benefit, right, it's about the reward. So in the UK, we have universal child benefit, and when we decided to take that away from top-rate taxpayers in the coalition government that I served in, so we took it away from just the the richest fifth quartile. Wow, it wasn't worth it in terms of the political heat we got. I mean, the arguments were clear. It's like, you don't need this. Why are we giving you this? I was getting it. It was ridiculous, and it's it's not nothing. But wow, it is absolutely embedded in the culture that you have a kid, you get this weekly payment from the government. It's horizontal redistribution to promote families and child, and people absolutely took it that way. They did not see it. No, you then talk about housing benefit or whatever. They're like, oh no, there's the welfare scroungers. They are, but no, my child benefit. No, that's different. It's amazing. It's a bit like Social Security here. People are perfectly capable of making this distinction.
I think that's the difference between the child tax credit and the dependent care credit to a big extent. You get the child tax credit, you have a child, we're giving you $1,000 at the end of the year.
Yeah.
With the dependent care credit, you actually have to say, oh, I have these qualifying
That's
expenses,
right. There's
right?
all kinds of
and so I'm more for expanding the dependent care credit than saying, okay, now we're just going to expand the size of the child tax credit because you had a child.
Yeah, but the child credit avoids both problems, right? Because you can cap it and there isn't this kind of protest,
That's
but at the same time, there's no sense that you're a scrounger because you're getting it. So.
That's right.
Let's go to the gentleman right there in the blue shirt.
Salim Firth from the Heritage Foundation, and very much related to this. So one of the clear problems that families are facing at birth is what an economist would call liquidity, right? So this isn't going to be solved by, Ramesh giving them $3,000 more in the coming
at
April,
the end of the
right?
year.
Yeah. And the cheapest way, it seems to me, of getting to some of the proposals that were just being discussed in this discussion is give them their tax credit early, their tax refund.
Yeah. Make it
Most of these
advanceable.
people are getting a tax refund the next April. How many, maybe a research question here, how many people who have babies in April are actually able to take family leave unpaid who, are, more than at another time of the year? So if we can, obviously you don't know exactly what somebody's next year tax liability is going to be, but that seems like a really ready, revenue neutral source of cash. It's their money
and
to begin with.
That was exactly my proposal for how to fund paid leave, which is, have advanced EITC, advanced child tax credit and child independent care credit, and let families access it, whenever they need it. And I think one of the problems with that is that even when we had the advanced EITC, it just seemed like it didn't take off. People were not really, that eager to cash in on the EITC. They actually liked the idea of having it lump sum at the end. But I think when it comes to childcare expenses, that's really a valuable, if you pitch it as, oh, this is your paid family leave plan, or this is your childcare plan, I think more people might be able to take it up.
Yeah, and that is in line with, remember, many of the people in the group, they liked the idea of having their payroll taxes cut because they wanted the relief throughout the year, right? And we actually did ask them, and we said, so if you were to get an expanded EITC to help with childcare, let's say it's $1,200, would you spend that on childcare, or would you spend it on other things? What would you spend it on? And most of them said, well, we'd spend it on what we usually spend our tax refund on.
To catch up.
To catch up.
Yeah.
I know one family that they had to catch up like several months of rent. They were just about to lose their house when they received their tax refund, and so most of that just went to paying past rent. So I personally am attracted to the proposals for periodic payments of these things, and I know that there wasn't that much success in take-up with the advanced EITC, but that was also very convoluted and complex.
I'm not clear why there wasn't.
And there are some proposals to make it deferred EITC, where you can take some of it in lump sum now and then defer it some throughout the year. So, but whatever the case, you have to make it simple and ensure that people know that they're gonna get the money.
Yeah.
It's just an opportunity to get it periodically rather than one lump sum.
That's right.
Yes, the lady behind. Yes.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Metzmer from Mother Jones Magazine. This is a question for the labs. I was just interested to know what your current research is and what else you're doing with these families, if anything, in Southern Ohio. And then I was curious to know if you're going to go back to your focus group and show them what's in the Trump budget and the big cuts to public housing, the wiping out of after-school care programs. I guess we're not going to lose health care yet, but are you going to ask them what they think of all that stuff?
Well, that sounds like a great idea. We actually had talked about reconvening because at the end of the focus group, people were like, we should do this again. This was so much fun. And we had something scheduled, but then one of our children got sick and we had to cancel it. But do you want to share a little about our other work?
Yeah. Well, and that's one thing to note is that, everyone really enjoyed this focus group. I mean, it was a very lively exchange of ideas. And so I think that the opportunity to empower working class young people to have their voices heard in these public conversations, whether it's about the Trump budget or work family policies, that's really important. And so we don't have any plans for reconvening this specific group, but that's an important idea. What we're doing is, since 2010, we began interviewing white working class young people about their stories of forming families and focusing on kind of their stories of forming relationships and what they're thinking about marriage. And that inquiry also, of course, led us into hearing their stories about finding stable work and the economic troubles as well. And so we're working on compiling all that in a book that we hope to have that will be completed soon, hopefully. And then also, I also recently joined David Blankenhorn. He's leading a group called Better Angels, and the idea is to bring together Trump administration supporters and critics for constructive conversation. And so a month after the election, we brought together 10 Trump supporters and 11 Clinton supporters, and it was the gunsmith owner sitting next to the psychologist. I mean, this was a very socioeconomically diverse, class diverse group, and that's something that I'm working on right now. And again, I think that's important because we have to help ensure that working class people, that their voices are being heard, that they have an important role to play in our civil society and our conversations about politics. So we have to find a way to have them be a part of our public conversation.
Yes, sir, in the back right there. I think this is our last question.
Blended families are a particular concern at National Coalition for Men, ncfm.org. So, and I didn't hear that word mentioned in particular. So, usually you talk about a non-custodial mom and possibly several non-custodial fathers. I mean, that's a typical pattern. And the non-custodial parent often has to use a lot of their so-called vacation time. Rather than for their kids, they're using it to go into court or whatever so they can even get access to their kids.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a problem. And I have a question on that daycare study. It felt to me, the daycare disadvantage result, felt to me like is that just strongest for the first child? I'm thinking for a multi-child family, I'm expecting the effect to be, I would say, considerably less. And yeah, okay, that's pretty much the question.
I guess maybe, did you all have this sort of non-custodial?
Yeah, that did come up with, briefly, that came up with one person who, he was paying child support. And he mentioned that that just kills the budget. And I think he was the only person in the group, but certainly I know that is, you can be working 60 hours a week, but you're going to be taking a big hit with the child support payments.
And he had actually made a decision to quit his job in order to spend more time with his son, who I believe he sees him on the weekends, but he was working at a factory. He was going full-time to school and working, so he literally had 17-hour days, Monday through Thursday, and then was often working overtime on weekends. So he told us that he had made that choice to quit his job in order to have time to see his son.
But I think, that's a dangerous thing to do because a judge will impute income if you voluntarily choose, for whatever reason, to not work. And saying the moment you get imputed income, then all of a sudden you have an imputed obligations, child support, which means rather than being unable to see your kid because you have time or money or other problems, you're in jail.
Well, I propose separately that if the non-custodial parent is providing more care, that should be taken into account when assessing their child support. We shouldn't just treat the non-custodial parent as a kind of walking ATM. There are other ways they could support the custodial parent, and one of the ways is through providing more care. Why doesn't that count? It doesn't at the moment.
On the child care front, I haven't sort of seen any kind of work that really distinguishes between the effects for, say, singletons versus kids in 2 or 3 parent families. I think that the effects would be fairly, similar for kids in, 1 child families versus 2, 3, or more child families. So, well, please join me in thanking our panelists and David and Amber Lapp. And please come up if you have questions or comments for our panel and mingle informally. Thank you.